it's Arjun. So I've been providing updates primarily on Saturday mornings, mostly the written product and the occasional monthly video. With some of the fast-moving events around the world, I thought some more frequent updates were in order, and I'll try that both with video and perhaps some shorter write-ups. Today's macro commentary tries to at least ask the question of, has Russia reached that point of no return where it enters pariah state status and we run the risk of long-term structural declines in Russian oil supply and what to do about it? And so the images, the reporting coming out of Ukraine are heartbreaking and horrific. As the civilian casualties and the atrocities mount, it's very difficult to process. And I think the question becomes, from an oil macro standpoint, so long as President Putin is still in charge, are we sort of past that point of no return for Russia, where it's going to be very difficult for them to get back into even reasonable graces for the rest of the world? And we're looking at long-term sanctions, long-term issues facing the country and the companies in the country. And so right now there are lots of questions people are asking on short-term sanctions. Will the US and possibly EU sanction their oil and gas industry, and what does that mean for oil prices over the next several weeks to months? And will India and China go along, or are we just talking about redirecting flow? These are all the kind of short-term types of questions people understandably ask that could cause prices to spike or even pull back. That is not what I'm getting at here. My question is, do we have to start factoring in the risk that we've seen peak Russian oil supply and the odds are going to grow that it declines? Now, there's some examples. Actually, the former Soviet Union. When the Berlin Wall fell for the next decade, we saw declining FSU, former Soviet Union supply. Now, demand fell as well as their economy imploded. And we could certainly see that play out this time as well, where the sanctions are clearly going to negatively impact the Russian economy and potentially Russian oil demand. You may even get, in theory, slightly higher exports over the next few years. The bigger question is beyond the next few years. So let's look at some examples. Iran comes to mind. Prior to the Iranian Revolution, Iran was producing over 5 times close to 6 million barrels a day. After a decade-long war with Iraq and sort of on-again, off-again sanctions from the US and others, Iranian supply has been as low as under 2 million barrels a day. And maybe the capacity right now is 3.5 to 4 million barrels a day, but still well below what it was doing 40 years ago. Look at Venezuela. Prior to President Chavez coming into power around 2000, they were producing over 3 million barrels a day. And after 20 years of sanctions and misinvestment and lots of issues, unfortunately, facing Venezuela, production has fallen to as low as 500,000 barrels a day. It might be up in the last few months, but 75-80% decline over 20 years. There are differences in Russia versus those other countries that I mentioned. Russia is clearly a top 3 today, at least, oil producer after Saudi Arabia and the United States. It's one of the world's largest natural gas producers, and of course is a critical natural gas producer to Europe. They're also, along with Ukraine, major producers of various agricultural and other industrial commodities. So the ability for the world to kind of do without Russia is significantly more challenging than it is for these other countries, which again perhaps allows for some quicker resolution, though that seems increasingly unlikely. We do see that already the banks and some of the major players in Russia are facing significant sanctions. And while the oil industry in Russia and the gas industry in Russia, you have a degree of separation from the host government. Lukoil, Rosneft, Gazprom structurally are set up somewhat differently than, say, National Iranian Oil Company or PDVSA, that provides some slightly better or slightly greater probability they could, I guess, muddle through some of this situation. I think it's going to be quite challenging. And so when you have 10 million barrels a day of production and 7 to 8 million barrels a day of export at risk of structural decline, at least at some point in the future, I think the question is, how do we compensate for that? So one of my themes in Super-Spiked has been, during this energy transition era, shouldn't we be favoring geopolitically friendly places like the United States and Canada, but not just those two, there are others as well, in disfavoring geopolitically unfavorable places like Russia and some of the Middle Eastern countries? I don't understand at all why there's not more emphasis being put on how to really get North American supply to offset Russia in particular. And I think when we look at the sanctions the country's facing, this is going to become a very, very pressing issue. There is nothing good about a price spike environment for anybody, certainly not for the average citizen in the world. And I think it's imperative that policymakers recognize this and don't just try and solve the short term, are we going to sanction or not, but recognize as long as President Putin's in power, there may be structural risk to Russian oil supply, and it's time to start taking the steps now to begin to address how we're going to offset that. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.